Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think we'll get started. We'll be a few people coming in, but I think it's best to go ahead. So I feel a little silly introducing someone who's so well known on this campus and someone who perhaps knew about the ideas of setting it up a decade before it became a thing. Still, I'm going to try and offer this incomplete narrative by way of introduction. Professor Balaram is a world-renowned biochemist and Professor Emeritus from the Institute of Science. He received his bachelor's degree from Ferguson's in 1967, his master's from IIT Kanpur, and his PhD from Carnegie Mellon in 1972. He first joined IISc as a lecturer in 1973 and became a professor in 1986. However, I'm not going to talk about his extraordinary 50-plus year career in scientific research or his awards. There are far more qualified people in this audience, and more of you probably know it better than I do. He's a teacher, colleague, sounding board mentor to many students, administrators, and faculty across institutions. And most of you, of course, know that he also served as a director of the Institute between 2006 and 2014. And it was during this time, and largely due to his push, that the IISc Archives was set up. Many who were instrumental in shaping it are in the audience today. Thank you so much for coming. He also wrote the editorial in Current Science for a very long time, and one need only glance at them to get a sense of breadth and depth of interest. And I find this particularly fascinating because this is a side job, right? So he wrote editorials for Current Science, and I thank Mr. Ahuja for giving me some statistics, for about 15 years on the trot. So that's twice in a month, which adds up to roughly about 360 editorials, which I think is far more than what a journalist would do in their career. So if someone can tell me these numbers are accurate, that'll be great. As it is, two of these editorials in 2008 were on the history of IISc, and today they are still some of the most, they're still, I think, the earliest widely accessible summaries of the early history of the Institute. I'm yet to find something that is as accessible as those two documents. I still keep referring back to them for digging out deeper sort of notes on which books to look into. On a personal note, I'd like to especially acknowledge his generosity and his active endorsement of the archives here at NCBS and at other science institutions. You can just go online and see, you'll see his name connected with the archives going back a good 10, 15 years. There is so much more one could say about him, but enough from me. Please do give a warm welcome to Professor Balaram again. The seats here, please just fill them up so that people who come later can start standing. The three entire empty rows here.
Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Venkat for inviting me to come and talk about a subject which is probably closer to my heart than most of the things that I have done in my own field of specialization. And the idea of archives and collecting the history of the Indian Institute of Science was really a hobby when I was the director there for several years. But I'd like to begin by showing you this page from an Amar Chitrakatha, which I found several years ago. Now, there are not many institutions which have actually made it to the pages of a children's comic. And the Indian Institute of Science certainly has done that. I don't know whether you have a comic on Harvard or a comic on MIT or Caltech, but you certainly have a book in which 2 pages are devoted to the Indian Institute of Science. This is, of course, a book which talks about Jamsetji Tata. And today, if you were to look at Jamsetji Tata in retrospect and ask the question, who are the 10 most important Indians of the last 150 years, you might find that Jamsetji Tata would make the list. You might also find that you were asked to name the 5 most important Indians of the last 150 years, you might still find that Mr. Tata would make the list. Why is this so? this comic book will actually tell you why it is so. It is so because Jamsetji Tata really brought to India the Industrial Revolution. The world transformed after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England. It was beginning to transform Europe and the United States. And around that time, Tata conceived the idea of the industrialization of India. And there were three things that Mr. Tata really wanted to do. One of them was to build a steel plant, because steel was considered essential for industrialization. The second was to build a hydroelectric power plant. And the third was to build a research institution. So you can see that he had all the three ingredients for the building of modern India in place. This comic book actually has most of the characters whom I'm going to talk about this afternoon. Here, for example, you will find Lord Curzon, who is a central figure in the story of the early days of the Indian Institute of Science. And here, what the comic book says is a little joke about Curzon, which used to do the rounds then. It says, I am a most superior person. My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. So Curzon was a man who was sort of full of himself, a very important figure actually in Indian history, as we will go along and see. The history of these times and the history of the Institute, the history of the rise of the Tatas, all of that actually can be summarized mostly summarized in these three books. There's Frank Harris's biography in 1925, which is actually the definitive work on Jamsetji Tata, and he'd never seen Jamsetji Tata. So everything that he wrote was exclusively from the records. And if you read the introduction to this edition, you will find that it is by a gentleman who actually met Mr. Tata as a journalist for the Times of India in those days. And he talked to him about the Indian Institute of Science. It hadn't been called the Indian Institute of Science, but the only thing that Mr. Tata spoke to the journalist about was really about the research institute. He was full of the research institute that he planned to set up. This is Dr. Subbarayappa's book, which was commissioned during the Platinum Jubilee year in 1984 and eventually appeared in 1992. And there is R.M. Lala's book in 2004. What are the origins of the idea of Mr. Tata of setting up a research institute in India? And he got this idea in the 19th century, long before Indian independence was thought about. And in 1889, he was present at a convocation address given by the then governor of Bombay at Bombay University. And what the governor said in this address was that it is only by the combined efforts of the wisest men in England, of the wisest men in India, that we can hope to establish in this old home of learning real universities which will give a fresh impulse to learning, to research, to criticism, which will inspire reverence and impart strength and self-reliance to future generations. And this is the most important thing, of our and your countrymen. So even in 1896, the governor of Bombay had clearly realized that imperial ambitions had only a certain time limit, and at some point or the other, there would be another country. In 1892, Tata instituted the Tata Scholarships for Study in England. And he thought of this idea of sending young students from India to study in England so they could come back now and then start doing the kinds of things that were being done in England in those days. So you can see that Tata's ideas on education were formed quite early. They were formed in the period between 1889 and 1892. I'll tell you why I'm telling you this, because this has some bearing on the importance of archival information, of documents in actually tracing the history of an institution. In 1893, and many of you would have read about this, Jamsetji Tata met Swami Vivekananda on the voyage from Yokohama to Vancouver. This is the famous voyage which Vivekananda took to go and address the World Congress on Religions, and it was following that that he really acquired worldwide fame. In 1896, a letter went to the governor of Bombay outlining a proposal, and in 1898, there was a provisional committee which presented Lord Curzon with the proposal. 1898 was also the year in which Jamsetji Tata wrote his famous letter to Vivekananda, which I will show you on a slide in a moment. And then all of these things happened. By 1909, the vesting order of the Indian Institute of Science was issued. It actually turns out that the first director of the institute arrived in 1906. He was already the director of the Indian Institute of Science, although there was no Indian Institute of Science officially constituted by the government of India, but the proposal had in fact in principle been accepted, and they had already appointed the director. So the constitution of the institute really involved the House of Tatas, the British government of India at that time, and the government of Mysore, which was effectively the Maharaja of Mysore. There were only two departments envisaged at the very beginning of the formation of the Indian Institute of Science, and this, I must say, in an institution which is actually confined to a single discipline. Now, if you were to have an institution at the beginning of the 20th century, and you were to choose two disciplines which would be important, what would they be? The Tata committees chose chemistry and they chose electrical technology. This is because for the development of a country, there are only two things which were important at that time: chemicals and power. I must say, I told the story to Venkat in the morning. I will tell you this, although I had not prepared to tell you this. In the year 2000, at the turn of the century, turn of the millennium and so on, Nature, which is a journal I think all of you admire, had commissioned a series of essays by famous people, and they were to write on what were the most important developments of 20th century science. I used to read these every week when they came out, and there was one which really attracted my attention because it was written by, I think it was a Czech or Polish scientist, and he said that one of the most important event of the 20th century in science was the Haber-Bosch synthesis of ammonia. Then I immediately read this because I had studied the Haber-Bosch synthesis and hated it when I was in college. And why did this gentleman consider the Haber-Bosch synthesis as the most important scientific event of the 20th century? The answer was very clear. The answer was that ammonia then immediately laid the route to the industrial production of ammonia, of urea. And once urea as a fertilizer was produced, famines were in fact abolished everywhere. There were still famines in India till the mid-1960s. The Green Revolution came only in the early 1970s. But fertilizers really removed the problem of food to a great extent. And therefore, chemistry was very, very important. At that time, today we measure the GDP in ways in which the government sometimes finds it difficult to decide whether the measurement is correct or not. But in those days, the measurement of a country's industrialization was actually the amount of sulfuric acid that it produced, because it was used everywhere. Chemistry and electrical technology, because power was important, because you needed power, you needed lighting, you needed power for machinery and so forth. So these were the only two departments. In 2005, when I was first appointed as the director of the Indian Institute of Science, I realized that in a few years we would be approaching the centenary of the institute. And centenaries needed to be celebrated in grand style in India. But then I didn't know very much about the history of the institute, and therefore I found there was very little of a documentary record anywhere other than the books that I showed you. What then should an institution do? The institution must then set up an archives and try to collect as far as possible all materials related to the history of the institute and document it in the archives. Later on, one can look at them and come to any kind of interpretation that one chooses. I addressed a seminar of archivists once, and I said, and this is the slide I used, there are four kinds of people who are needed. You need collectors, those who just like to collect things and don't throw away anything, important pieces of paper. Then there are archivists who might sift through these papers, catalog them, organize them, and make them available. Then there are historians who must then come along and look at all these pieces of paper, look at them, and write history, and then there must be readers. Now, of course, history can be written in many ways. You can look at the same pieces of paper and write two different histories. That, of course, is the task of historians. The task of the reader, of course, is to read whichever history he or she likes. And today, of course, when we have a great deal of rewriting of history, one must always look at this. History is written from factual material that is available and documented one way or the other. It's up to you to read it. It's rather like science. You know, in most scientific papers, the facts must be correct. The interpretations can be wrong. So later on, someone else can correct that interpretation. So in this area, we need the facts. So we have to start collecting. Now, it turns out that my inspiration for becoming a collector, not really an archivist, came from this book which I was trying to read at that time. It was The Last Mughal by William Ramsay, and this was on the fall of the Mughals, and it was on Delhi in 1857 when Bahadur Shah Zafar was finally deposed and sent away into exile. But I liked this. He said that in order to document what happened in 1857 in Delhi, you must really look at resources. And these allow 1857 in Delhi to be seen for the first time from a properly Indian perspective and not just from the British sources. He also said discovering the sheer scale of the treasures held by the National Archives was one of the highlights of this project. The wonderful thing about the National Archives, which were actually set up by the British, was that the British documented everything and they deposited them in the archives. So if it was the Education Department or the Home Department, every department had stacks and stacks of files which were deposited there. And he said, for example, he quotes Vincent Smith in 1923 that the story has been chronicled from one side only, and so he went into the National Archives. And here he says that he found great unwieldy mountains of chits, pleas, orders, petitions, complaints, receipts, all of these in the National Archives, all neatly bound in string and boxed up in the cool, hushed, air-conditioned vaults of the Indian National Archives. When I saw this, my first inclination was, I must go to the National Archives. I've never been to the National Archives, but fortunately for me, around the time when we started doing this, I was able to come into contact with many people, and this is my slide of acknowledgements, which must come more or less at the beginning of the presentation that I would make. I will start here with Dr. Ratnakar, who is pictured here and who's sitting here in the front row. He was in Delhi by then, and he was in fact a person who was passionately interested in old history, in the archives, and who used to go to the National Archives once this project began with a regularity which I think very, very few people would have been able to really do. I went to the National Archives only once. That was when I was the director. He took me there, and we went in late in the afternoon, maybe around 3 o'clock, and we sat there till the archives closed, and he showed me, these are the kinds of files I'm looking at. And I said, it's wonderful, and I began to look at them. And then some guy comes along and says, it's time to close the archives, and you better leave now. But he was very kind. All those students of history who were studying there were asked to go, but he let us be the last people actually to leave that day, and I'd actually sampled the kind of treasure which was there. Once I realized that this was a treasure, I asked Ratnakar, can't we get copies of all of this? He said, yes, we can. There's a photocopying machine, and we'll photocopy. I think what he did afterwards was absolutely heroic. He got 3,000 pages or so photocopied in the National Archives, and I would urge all of you to visit it once and try to get one page photocopied there. You will realize how difficult it is. I think he probably used his persuasive abilities with the operators, who were, I think, struck by his persistence, and they allowed this. Here is the second person who really was critically important in the early days of this project, even before we decided to set up an archives, and that was Ricky Krishnan. Ricky Krishnan was one of these young students who didn't like what he was doing, and he sort of attached himself to me as my assistant at Current Science. His only job was to talk to me and then go out and collect some material. And he would call me every day, once in the night and once in the morning, on the kinds of things he collected. We did a trial run for history. We did a trial run for history by doing the history of Current Science, because Current Science was started in 1932, and in 2007 it was celebrating its 75th year. So we first did the history of Current Science. Commonly in Bangalore, it is thought that C.V. Raman started Current Science. You see, C.V. Raman is usually credited with starting just about everything in Bangalore. And he came to Bangalore in 1934 and 33, 34, and the Indian Academy of Sciences was started by C.V. Raman. But Current Science was started in 1932. It was started a couple of years before Raman came to Bangalore. There's an editorial in Current Science, unsigned at that time, which says, on a need for an Indian Academy of Sciences. So I read this editorial, and of course, Professor Ramsay, who was my mentor at Current Science in the early days, said it was started by Raman, because everything was ascribed to Raman. But when I read the editorial, the language seemed different, because the language seemed the same as the other unsigned editorials which were appearing in Current Science at that time. So who then wrote the editorial was the first problem that Ricky Krishnan and we discovered that it was C.R. Narayan Rao who started the journal. He was professor of zoology at Bangalore University, and he was the first editor of Current Science. And he was the man who started it along with 3 other people, one of whom was at the Indian Institute of Science, and Srinivasaya, who was the second editor, and Narayan Rao, Srinivasaya, and all had original offices of Current Science in what is now the chemistry, the inorganic and physical chemistry department of the institute. So every institution in Bangalore, including of course NCBS, came out of the Indian Institute of Science. So it's an old institution, so one should study its history. We began to set up the archives. This is Mr. Ahuja, who's also here, and I come back to Mr. Ahuja. Mr. Ahuja is the man who actually started the archives at the Indian Institute of Science. He was the coordinator of the archives and publication cell when we set it up. I had the advantage of being the director, so I could set up these, give them a budget head, and get them going. And I told Venkat in the morning that an archive must have a budget head, because then it will be it will outlive directors and others and keep going. Otherwise, you never know when things change. Because if you have a budget line in government, you'll get a 10% inflationary increase every year, even if you don't get anything extra. Soumitra Ranganathan came later, much later, but she's the one who did much of the digitization, organization of all the collected material, which is now available in the archives, and one can actually do exhibitions and things like this for different departments and so on periodically, and that's what she has been doing. This gentleman is going to come repeatedly through the rest of my presentation. He is a man who is a professor in a department of education, actually an associate professor. It turns out that if somebody retires as an associate professor in a department, he must have done something original. Because this is why departments do not like them, they're usually not promoted. I have many examples of this at the Indian Institute of Science. M.K. Subramaniam, who discovered fundamental things in yeast cell biology and who appeared even the 50 years of M.K. Subramaniam's paper was celebrated in Nature, it turns out retired as an assistant professor. And so Kim Sebely is an associate professor at Kent State University. But what he's really been interested in is the history of higher education in India, especially higher technical education. And we found Kim Sebely through the internet, and those were the early days of the internet. Internet was not quite what it is today. Ricky Krishnan found an article by him, which I will refer to, on the history of the Tatas and the influence of the Tatas on higher education in India. But the rest of the story is really, many people will come in this story. There's Jamsetji Tata, of course, there's Lord Curzon, there's Swami Vivekananda, there's Sister Nivedita, and there is the central figure of my story, Tata's secretary, Tata is what I would call almost executive assistant is what you would call him today. He was in fact his right-hand man. In some ways, I would also say you might view him as his foster son, because he actually had him educated and then brought him back. Bojorji Patsha is the man who executed all three of the major Tata projects: the Research Institute, the Tata Steel Plant, as well as the hydroelectric project. He is the central figure, central and somewhat forgotten figure in the history of the Tatas. This is the famous letter written by J.N. Tata to Swami Vivekananda on November 23rd, 1898. And I'll show you on the next slide something that's easier to read, where he actually asked Swami Vivekananda to support a campaign to set up the Indian Institute of Science. If you read this letter carefully, he says here, I recall these ideas in connection with my scheme of a research institute for India, of which you have doubtless heard or read. This tells me that he did not talk to Swami Vivekananda about his scheme. He only talked to him generally about education. He talked to him about education and industrialization, and Swami Vivekananda actually agreed that it was very important to bring modern science and technology to India. In fact, Vivekananda writes this extremely clearly in his editorial. He asks him, perhaps you had better begin with a fiery pamphlet rousing our people in this matter. I should cheerfully defray all the expenses of publication. Because Tata had begun at this time to face the problems of the British government. And he knew that he needed to build up public sympathy for the idea of a government-supported research institute to be built in India in the last years of the 19th century. Why am I telling you this? Today I would urge all of you to go to the internet. The internet is a source of great information. In fact, it is such a wonderful treasure that we cannot afford to lose it. But it is also a source of the greatest misinformation that one can possibly find. And now Google allows you to get both information and misinformation in equal measure. All you have to do is to type into Google J.N. Tata and Swami Vivekananda, and you'll get many things. Now, one of the things which comes out, and you know, the Google algorithm is wonderful. It will order things in order of importance according to your search terms. And the Google algorithm now gives you, as the fifth or sixth item on this, you will get a site called Arise Bharat. And on the Arise Bharat site, you will find that it will begin with the connection. And it will say that J.N. Tata was inspired by Swami Vivekananda to set up a research institute. This is clearly not what you read in these lines. It is also clearly not borne out by the chronology, because he had already set up the Tata scholarships in 1892, where the voyage in the ship was in 1893. He'd already begun to talk about this with people in his surroundings. because the governor of Bombay's address of the 1889 convocation clearly made a great impression on his mind, on what he should do. But even more importantly, this letter is interpreted, and I think, Jitu, this should be important to you, as director. When you're appointed as a director of an institution, would this be the kind of appointment letter that you would get? On this site it says that J.N. Tata offered the directorship of the institute to Swami Vivekananda. Now, of course, this is another site which has a wonderful thing on it which says threats. And I would urge all of you to click onto the threats. And you might find that even I might be listed as a threat. Now, this is from an article written by a scholar in Calcutta who worked at Calcutta University, who wrote this in Prabuddha Bharata in October of 1978. And this is a footnote which tells you, which he's picked up from the Daily News, which appeared in Vancouver, which will give you all the dates. It will tell you all the people who got off the ship and everything, so you get your dates right here. But it's interesting in a way to look at those times. Even the people who got off a ship were recorded. It says that Mr. C. Lullaboy, Mr. Tata, and servants had no names, and Mr. S. Vivekananda. These are the people who got off that ship that day in 1893, all clearly recorded here. And there are various things. In Harris's book in 1925, the Vivekananda episode is a footnote. In Subbarayappa's book in 1992, Subbarayappa says, unfortunately, Vivekananda's reply to Jamsetji still remains untraced. This is what he says. I've given you the page numbers, page 21 here. Now, this tells you what are the problems of archival records. This is now for, it's actually for Venkat, this is trying to trace the Vivekananda connection. This is the editorial in Prabuddha Bharata on Mr. Tata's scheme, which appeared in April 1899. The letter was written in November of 1898. So this is the response, and this is a strong endorsement of the Tata scheme. But did Swami Vivekananda write this letter? This editorial. We do not know, but he ran the journal. So I guess all unsigned editorials were written by him. But now you find Swami Vivekananda there as the author. Now is this, and this is from the Jamsetji Tata archives, and this was recently, Mr. Ahuja managed to locate all this at Jamsetji, brought copies back, and I've made a slide from this. But this is what he says. So this the signature there, you cannot take seriously, because this is not there in the original copy of Prabuddha Bharata, which I saw at the Ramakrishna Mission many years ago. So in those days, all the editorials were unsigned. But presumably they were written by Swami Vivekananda. He actually praises this scheme very much, and he says that the scheme grasps the vital points of weakness in our national well-being with a clearness of vision and tightness of grip, the masterliness of which is only equaled by the munificence of the gift with which it is ushered to the public. So it is a wonderful example, and it says here, this is in the Journal of the Ramakrishna Mission, says, modern science penetrates every pore of the two giant feeders of mankind, agriculture and commerce. And then at the end, we repeat, no idea more potent for good to the whole nation has seen the light of the day in modern India. Let the whole nation, therefore, forgetful of class or sect interest, join in making it a success. You cannot find a more ringing endorsement of a proposal to set up a research institute, and this is in 1899. So there is no doubt that Swami Vivekananda played a very important role, because by writing this, what happened is that many people associated with him, influenced with him, were immediately in support of the Tata scheme. But my own attempts at trying to find what were the early problems in the setting up of the institute came upon when my colleague Ricky Krishnan, Ricky, whose picture I showed you, was unfortunately a young man who was taken by cancer at a very young age when he was still in his 30s. So in 2010, just shortly after our centenary, he passed away. But Ricky found this paper and brought it to me. It says the Tatas and university reform in India. I think it's a wonderful article. It should probably be read by the people who are drafting the new education policy. But what will happen is, of course, nobody will read it. But archives should have all of this. But it has a quotation there which I will tell you, which summarizes all the problems. It's a quotation of Lord Curzon in 1901, where he says to start with polytechnics and so on is like presenting a naked man with a top hat when what he wants is a pair of trousers. The one thing about Lord Curzon which you must admire is Lord Curzon was a wonderful administrator, a man who knew exactly what the crux of the problem was, who was prejudiced, he was an imperialist, but there can be no doubt about the fact that he was very clear-headed in what he wanted to do. One comes across so many muddle-headed people that even if you don't agree with them, it's nice to see a person who's absolutely clear in his views. Who was Kim Severley? What was he interested in? He came to India as a PhD student, and his PhD problem was to trace the history of the IITs, because the IITs were being set up in the 1950s. They were being set up with foreign collaboration. IIT Kanpur was being set up with American collaboration with a consortium of the most famous American universities, and Severley's job was to try and see what was the connection. So he came to India, and he realized that the IITs had no history. They were just being set up. There was nothing really to study. He then realized, he asked the question, what's the background in which the IITs were studied? And then he discovered the Indian Institute of Science. This was in the early 1960s, 1962. He discovered the Indian Institute of Science, and then he says that it was probably more important to understand how the institute was created, and he says this would be very important in looking at education, higher technical education in India in the future. Once I knew that he was at Kent State, I sent him an email and we began to correspond. Eventually I was able to bring him for our centenary celebrations. He came for the launch of the centenary in December of 2008, and he says, it was during that visit when he came to India in 65-66 for research on the establishment of the IITs, I discovered what I still regard as the source of the social and intellectual capital that led to their establishment after independence, the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. However important foreign technical assistance was to the establishment of the IITs, I thought and still think the story could be more accurately told through a better understanding of the struggle to establish your institute. You can imagine when I received this email in December of 2007, I had by that time finished the 75th year of current science. This then gave me enough adrenaline to take me through all of 2008 trying to collect what was the history of the Indian. It required then an American professor, an unpromoted American professor interested in the history of an obscure Indian institution to really galvanize even the search for the records of that institution. Eventually, it boils down that it is a story of one Indian and two Englishmen. That's the story. I like putting these arrows because, in chemistry, everything's connected by arrow. Chemical A is connected to chemical B by an arrow. And it turns out that in human affairs also, human beings are actually interconnected. Sometimes by chemicals as in chemical ecology, but sometimes by conversations and interactions and so forth. And I must also say that his interactions with Curzon, his interactions with Travers, the first director of the Institute, were extraordinarily negative. He didn't get along with Curzon, he didn't get along with Travers. Nevertheless, Mr. Padshaw might be considered really the true successor to Jamsetji Tata, because Tata passed away in 1904. He's the man who took the project through to completion. But this is the first document. This document is the memorandum presented on the 31st of December, written on the 31st of December 1898. It's got ready. Because what was 31st of December 1898? 31st of December 1898 was the day that Lord Curzon landed at Bombay to take over as the Viceroy of India. He was to make the long overland journey from Bombay to Calcutta, which was then the capital of British India. So he stopped in Bombay, and when he stopped in Bombay, the very first thing that he did as the new Viceroy of India, and probably as one of the most powerful Viceroys of India, was to receive a delegation. And that delegation was led by Jamsetji Tata, and what they presented to him was this memorandum asking Lord Curzon to get the British government to support the starting of a research institute. So this is the last thing which I read to you. This is the provisional committee which went in deputation to him and said, "We beg to thank your lordship, etc., for receiving this on the second day after your landing in Indian soil to assume charge of your high duties. It is an augury of hope that your lordship's term of office will prove of the highest benefit to the people of the country in the years to come." Curzon, of course, was also the man who presided over the partition of Bengal, and which was somewhat abortive. But explanatory memoranda to this draft bill came in June of 1899, again authored by Mr. Padshaw. He already had begun to worry. He was sure that he would manage to set up, the Tata University would be set up. He'd already begun to worry about staffing. In fact, all of you will realize that faculty selections are most important. Actually, directorial selections are even more important, but faculty selections are also important, especially if you're selecting professors in the old system in which you would like the professor to set up the department. And he says that both Lord Ray, who was the governor of Bombay, and Mr. Tata wanted to have people who would be with the highest qualifications. And therefore, he says, as Germans of merit and many quiet Englishmen who would be glad to comply if called, would not care to apply in response to advertisements, I've taken it upon myself to sort of collect privately a number of such eminent names. This is what today we would call a search and selection process. But the searching process in India now has completely deteriorated. The selection process, of course, still remains. But you can imagine a man on the last year of the 19th century worrying about how to select the best people for an institution which has still not been set up. There's a lot of discussion. In fact, there is no place where the Indian Institute has been more misunderstood, I used to think in earlier years, than in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. The name of Tata is associated with the Tata Institute, but very often they never really knew what was the connection between the Indian Institute of Science and their own institution. They were always viewed as an institution which was in some kind of competition. And then there was also this other problem. What is an institute? What is a university? You will still have that problem when you have the NIRF rankings of the Ministry of Human Resource Development. They still do not know. But it turns out when these proposals were written, there was one proposal in 1899 which said a research institute in India. There was another proposal in 1900 which called it the Indian University of Research. And this proposal was the one presented at the end of 1899, where Mr. Padshaw authored all of this. He wrote the preface, and then he says, he's given the scheme and proposal, and he's a very optimistic man. As soon as the proposal is given, he believes it's been accepted. He says the Indian University of Research has now been launched on its career. That's in December of 1899. It would take another 10 years before the vesting order of the institute really came. But this is the proposal. Look at that. It's a proposal for a university. It's got scientific and technical departments, medical departments, philosophical and educational departments. And in addition to all of that, very modest budget of 3 lakhs of rupees per year. So it gives you a sense of the times. It also gives you a sense of the kind of vision that would have been there behind writing these documents. What an archive really does is allows you to see these documents, and sometimes seeing these documents, it allows you to draw a little bit of inspiration on the very much more modest visions with which our committees might operate today. But the ingredients for building an institution were worried about in this period. Endowment, it was 30 lakhs. Where did this 30 lakhs figure come from? This was 30 lakhs worth of property in Bombay, which were being handed over to the institute. The rent on this would be 1.25 lakhs per year, and that would be the income of the institute. But Tata also realized that real estate would appreciate over the years. What Tata did not realize, that after a century, the real estate cannot be capitalized. I cannot now sell the buildings that the institute owns in Bombay, which will now be worth many thousands of crores of rupees, which would create an unmatched endowment for an Indian research institution. But that is another story. The annual grant, Government of India or Mysore, and you needed land which the Mysore government would give. The Maharaja of Mysore is a very important man in this story, but it must, because he granted the land. But it must also be remembered that when the land was granted, the Maharaja of Mysore was just a boy. He was still a minor. And it was actually the Maharani who was there, who was acting then as the regent, who really was a very far-sighted lady who in fact granted all these lands to the Indian Institute of Science. She doesn't quite get the credit that she should, but that is the way life is very many times. By this time, Pacha had begun to negotiate with everybody to get money, to get the land, and to get the scheme approved, and to start off the institution. How did he do this? He would go to the government and say that the Maharaja of Mysore has agreed to give the land. He would go to the Maharaja of Mysore and tell him that the government has agreed to give me the money. And then he would go back and rewrite his proposals. This came to the eye of the Secretary of the Home Department of the Government of India, who then wrote to him saying that the Viceroy desires that you will desist from quoting his name or views in a context in which you have no authority to use them, and where their unauthorized use can have no other consequence than to prejudice the future of your scheme. So when I saw this, I thought this was a wonderful way of actually doing a project. You know, we could go to the Department of Biotechnology and tell them DST has agreed to this, if you will give half the money. And then you go to DST and tell them DBT has agreed to give you half the money. And then you go to a third department and tell them, look, these two departments have already agreed. If you come on board, it will be a wonderful consortium. And we would then get it all set up. That's exactly what Pacha was doing, except that he was dealing with people who were very much more powerful and very much more difficult than government is today. But by this time, there was some idea that we must have a location for this institute, and the two locations which were being actually considered by a committee which had been appointed for this process were Roorkee and Bangalore. And the committee wrote this wonderful report. I've reproduced this document because this is again from the National Archives, so you can see how it looks. And very nicely written: climate, health, situation, site, support, scientific. And I just read, I've expanded a little bit. Climate in Bangalore, it says equable but enervating and unsuitable for continued active work in the body. This, I think, is true, because at NCBS, sometimes I have seen in those very comfortable sofas, some students stretched out in the middle of the afternoon. And it is a very enervating climate. Health, plague and fever prevalent. But Roorkee, especially good. Roorkee, bracing for 5 months, subtracting 3 months vacation, there would be 2 to 3 months hot and trying weather. So the vacations would be in England, you'd go by ship and come back, and the rest of the time you could go to Missouri or something. And this is what the British thought. But luckily, this was in British territory, and the British had no intention of supporting the scheme, whereas this was in Mysore state, and the Maharaja was ready to give the land. The British didn't quite have that much control over the princely states. They got what they wanted from them, but they allowed them to do some things in other ways. But when this report on Bangalore and Roorkee was discussed, Curzon actually said this, and I like this very much. He says, I agree with all the conclusions arrived at. The squabble over the climatic conditions of Bangalore and Roorkee is an interesting illustration of the combined one-sidedness and irascibility of men of science. Curzon was a very clear thinker. Why have I put this here? I found this in a document in the National Archives. I made this slide 10 years ago, and I can't find that paper anymore. But on the side of that paper, the 3,000 pages of it, so when you read it, you can't find them again, there was this initial C. And I knew that it was Curzon, and the language says it's C, and that's how Curzon signed it. But I'll show you at the very end something which gives me greater hope that it was in fact Curzon. But you know, Curzon in retrospect must be looked at. If you read this book, India from Curzon to Nehru by Durga Das, he actually says something very interesting. He says what Curzon started, Nehru finished many years later. Curzon did many things which were good, many things which were terrible. But then it does turn out that men who have a great historical impact always may belong to that category. Winston Churchill, who was no angel himself, said this about Curzon. He said the morning had been golden, the noontide was bronze, and the evening lead. This was an assessment of Curzon's career in great contemporaries. But all were polished till it shone after its fashion. And there are many assessments of Curzon in the literature, and he is an important factor if you look at the history of higher education in India. Pacha by this time had already invited Curzon to lay a foundation stone of the institute, even though Curzon had not agreed. Today, of course, that's the best way to get an institute started. If you are able to get Mr. Modi to lay the foundation stone of the institute, then MHRD would have no option but to fund the institution. But Curzon said nothing doing, I will not come. But this is what Pacha wrote to William Ramsay, who the Tatas by then, Pacha actually, and Jamsetji Tata, had recruited. Ramsay thought he was working for the British government, but actually Ramsay was working for the Tatas. And he came, the conduct of the Viceroy in declining to lay the foundation stone, and yet in visiting the site proposed to be allotted to the Institute, makes his veiled hostility more marked than ever. The fact that he could write this about the Viceroy of India, the most influential Englishman, who was going to, but he says, if we are beaten for the present, we are not dismayed. We cannot give up the idea. And then he says that there's nothing that can be done for the benefit of India better than to bring this institution into being at that time. He also writes to Ramsay, because Ramsay responds. He says that he feels disappointment in your last letter, which seems to show that we can no longer quote your advice. Because Ramsay is by this time becoming cautious, because Pacha quotes Ramsay to Curzon, Curzon to Ramsay, and so on. But he's getting his job done. But by that time, they found that it was going to be difficult to get Englishmen to come here, the better scientists to come and start off the institute. But Pacha is worried about the faculty. He says a research institute staffed by men whose research is of the bottle washer order is an absurdity. Now we have many institutes which have been started in India in recent years, which I don't think, today you wouldn't be able to make these assessments, but this is the kind of thing that you find in archival documents which tells you. Who was Pacha? Pacha was an extraordinary man. An extraordinary man. He lived at a time, he was senior to Gandhi. He was doing all of these things. Remember that Mahatma Gandhi, whom we venerate now, came to India only in 1915. And who was the man who brought Gandhi back to India to lead the Congress. It was in fact Gokhale. And Gokhale was in fact Padsha's mentor. In fact, he was to become Gokhale's assistant when he came from Karachi, but Jamsetji Tata asked him to become his assistant to do all these projects. Gokhale suggested that it was better he do those projects, and he went to work for Tata. So he had a lot of correspondence with Gokhale, which is there in the archives, and it is very interesting. But there is one meeting between Padsha and Gandhi in London when Gandhi was still a barrister. And Gandhi has an assessment of Padsha, which I thought was really remarkable when you look at it in the paper. Gandhi writes that he met a Mr. Padsha, and he was an extremely eccentric man. Now, you can't find anybody who had greater personal eccentricities than Gandhi. But Padsha had even greater personal eccentricities than Gandhi. He was even then, he was a vegetarian. He wouldn't go in a horse-drawn carriage because he didn't want to cause damage to the horse, and therefore he would walk. And he would walk any number of kilometers, and he would go all over. And he was actually, I would say, in many ways, personally extraordinarily eccentric. But he was actually determined. But if you look at the kind of letters, by this time there's Ramsay to Curzon, 1903, on stuffing. And he says it's very important to get technical men with technical training and leave them to the management if you get 3 or 4 first-rate men. But he says if you don't get first-rate men, and this is what Ramsay writes, if not, you will have a few more impractical dreamers like Bose, whose papers are not accepted by the Royal Society. Who was he talking about? He was talking about Jagdish Chandra Bose, who had then gone to London to present his papers. Sister Nivedita was Bose's strong champion in London. He was, in fact, talking about what you would today call, I guess, plant physiology. Interpreted in many ways, and he calls him an impractical dreamer, although I think you need impractical dreamers. They're the ones who do the most practical things. Bose's work on wireless communication is still absolutely fundamental. But there's something interesting he says here about America. He says America has been developed by producing scientific work which is useful in the 19th century, which is largely technologically driven. And he says science must first be applied to industry. It is only later that it can be cultivated for its own sake. And this is the English assessment of American science at the end of the 19th century. But there are very interesting things that you can find if you're an archivist. Ram Guha told me that there was a paper which he had once seen. So I wrote to the University of Strathclyde Archives at that time, got this letter, and this was very interesting. A letter written by Sister Nivedita of the Ramakrishna Mission to Patrick Geddes, the Scottish polymath who came to India, and he was everything from botanist to the Bose biographer to town planner. Says, the last time I saw Mr. Tata's secretary, he was quarreling with Ramsay in order to have yourself named as the principal of the institute. And I thought it was wonderful. 2 of my most illustrious predecessors would have been Patrick Geddes and Swami Vivekananda, but it did not happen. By this time, Curzon's told Ramsay that effectively what the Americans would say, that he just hates Padsha's guts, and Padsha should get out of this as quickly as possible. But then Ramsay defends Padsha. He actually says that he is a good man, he's sincere, absolutely unselfish, and gives all his services even without a salary. He's only interested in the project. But where are the Padsha papers? We do not know. Tim Sebery wrote to me in 2007 that if you can locate them, the real price in building your eye would be Mr. Padsha's letter copybooks. I copied extensively from them in 1967. They were brown covered. I don't recall where they are. He says he found, he copied them by hand, and he says that these were brown covered. I hope these books are not lost when, as I understand, the Tata archive was established in Pune, Jamshedpur, In Mr. Ahuja's most recent trip to Jamshedpur a couple of months ago, We have found some of these papers. We don't know whether these are the papers which Sebeli saw, but it's wonderful archives which has been set up in Jamsetji, where all of these things are available, some of them looking really old, wonderful, and absolutely unread and not looked at by anybody at all. But there are many letters. By 1905, there is Ramsay writing to Tata about the possible, by now it is Durab Tata, about the possible appointment of the first director of the institute. But the other man in the story really, and I have to hurry now because I see my time running out, the other man in the story is the first director, British director. The most important thing to remember, there have been only 2 directors of the Indian Institute of Science, I'm not one of them, who have been fired by the council. One of them was Maurice Travers, the first director, and the other one was C.V. Raman. So it turns out that I think 2 of the most important directors, both for scientific accomplishment and for administrative and other accomplishments, were in fact fired. So I think it's important to have neither of these accomplishments if you have to have a long and stable tenure. But along with Ricky Krishnan's help at that time, searching the internet and searching for addresses, we located the grandsons of Travers, not in England, but in America. And having located Travers' grandsons, we invited them to come to Bangalore. They arrived. This is them at the Indian Institute of Science. And University College London had all the Travers papers, but they wouldn't give them to us. I got some of them on microfilm by paying, but they still wouldn't give them to us. They didn't know what we were going to do. But once I located the Travers grandsons, they claimed the papers as the successors of Travers. And then the University College London had to hand the papers over to them. And then over the years, they've been persuaded to put those papers together, and now a book has been published. This is effectively the unpublished, unedited manuscripts of the Maurice Travers autobiography, which was released in 2016, published now by the Institute. So this is a picture of Travers. This is a picture, I think, taken somewhere at the West End Hotel on a horse, and he would come on horseback to the campus, to at that time the Virgin campus of the Institute. By 1909, the vesting order had been issued, and my time has run out, and if I can have a few more minutes, I will show you the remaining slide if time is not a major constraint. But look at this. This is the constitution of the governing structures of the institution. To make it the Indian Institute of Science, you have the Viceroy, and the Vice Patrons are the governors of Madras, Bombay, the Lieutenant Governors of Bengal, the United Provinces, Punjab, Burma, etc., going all the way down to the Governor General of Balochistan. So you get a good feeling when you see all of this, and you have all these people there, and we've actually located all the first accounts in the original. They used to be handwritten. They're all available for viewing. These are some of the pictures that were taken in those days. Not much of a record remains. A few fragmentary photographic records which are put together. Some of them still need to be interpreted as to the dates on which they were taken and so on. And these are the first laboratories. I think you must see them. These are the laboratories that Travers built for electrical technology and general chemistry. Nice large rooms. He built the first workshop. And in 1914, the Institute had its first function. I don't think the campus was complete. The main building had still not been fully finished. But Lord Willingdon, later the Viceroy of India, but at that time the Governor of Bombay, came on a visit, and they had put all these things. These were legended later as the Viceroy's visit. When they were legended later as the Viceroy's visit, I found in the Travers correspondent that it was Willingdon who came. But I once showed this to someone who was in the governor's office here in the Raj Bhavan in Bangalore. I pointed out to me that Willingdon was not the Viceroy at that time, but he was the Governor of Bombay. So you can see the legends to figures are written later. So in archival records, one has to be very careful about what you see. You can't believe everything that you see. It is not authentic because it might have been pasted in by someone a little bit later. So it was in fact Willingdon who came, and these are the Travers letters written in 1950. He lived for a very long time. He lived until the golden jubilee of the Institute. So when the Institute invited him, located him and invited him, he wrote this letter to the then director. These are the letters that first inspired me to start the archives, because these letters had all been folded up, put into a sack and thrown into one corner where they were all just moldy, and when I think we began to search for papers, we found those papers, and this was then a treasure. So if there's one treasure that you find, maybe there are more somewhere if you keep looking. And so Travers actually said about his departure from the Institute. He says, I had achieved so far as possible what I undertook when I left for India. But I had to accept as true that as it is in the nature and essential constitution of things, calumny and abuse are essential parts of triumph. So today when you look, for instance, at a great deal of abuse being heaped upon people, you will find that those people have also done a great deal for the country, but abuse can still be there. His last visitor in Bangalore was Lord Willingdon. He says it here. That's when I found that it was indeed Lord Willingdon, but he was not the Viceroy of India. Willingdon came, those few buildings had been built, those labs were there. He said, I had no idea that there was anything like this in India. And Travers said, there's nothing like it in India and nothing better in Great Britain. In the Tata Memorial in Bombay, in 1905, when the public tributes were paid, this is what one of Tata's long-term associate, Bhalchandra Krishna, said. He said, the magnum opus of his life, which will always keep his memory green in India, is undoubtedly the Research Institute, about the establishment of which the Government of India published a long resolution only a few days ago. By 1905, resolutions had been published, but it took another 4 years before this really happened. We didn't locate very much for the archives in terms of photographic records. This is one which came from the Times of India archives, which tells you exactly the date on which the statue that you see there was unveiled. In the center, when I was there, I was the custodian of the Institute when the centenary was celebrated. So in addition to bursting crackers and having seminars, one needed to produce a postage stamp. So I negotiated with the Department of Post that we should be allowed 2 stamps. As usual, they didn't answer, but about a month before, after we had lined up the Vice President of India to release the stamps, I told them, look, we are already getting somebody to release the stamps. What about the stamps? Then they said, yes, we are sending you a person, and he'll help you to design the stamp. And Mr. Ahuja received that person, and he came along, and we don't know how to design. They said there's one thing, you can't have a single person on the stamp. You can't have a picture of anybody. So we can't have Jamsetji Tata's picture, but Jamsetji Tata already had a stamp. So he said, can we have a building? I said, yes, you can have a building. So there's the building. Then he said, you can't have one person. Can we have many people? There's no rule against having many people on the stamp. So then who are the people you put on the stamp? And with our imperfect understanding of historical events, you have to choose the people. And we don't have any time. So we hastily chose the people. And I don't think anybody looked at the stamp afterwards, didn't interpret it and all. This is how it was done. And the right side of the stamp has all the people who are important in setting it up and who were not scientists but involved in putting it up. The left side has all the people who might have been important as alumni of the Institute, as a director of the Institute, as a very important scientist, and so on. There's Homi Bhabha, there's G.N. Ramachandran, there's Satish Dhawan, and there is C.V. Raman. And I picked them up. And on this side, who did I pick? I picked the Maharaja of Mysore, I picked Swami Vivekananda, and then I smuggled these 2 people in. That is Burjoni Patsha, whom nobody knows, and that's Maurice Travers, an Englishman on Indian stamp, who also nobody knows. And sometime later, especially the students, I'm sure sometime will come when your children are going to be asked a quiz question on one of those TV shows. They'll get 1 crore rupees if they answer the question right. Who are the people pictured on that stamp? What I've outlined to you is a visionary approach of Jamsetji Tata and Burjotji Padsha to actually creating a research institute in India when India really had nothing of the sort. Now, where do visionary approaches come? Visionary approaches also come sometimes from the kind of people whom you have involved in setting up projects. Now, when the Tata Steel project was set up at Jamshedpur, the man who went right at the beginning to the location with the architects, with the technical people, was Padsha. But in Mr. Ahuja's most recent trip to the Tata archive when he brought it back, there were 2 artifacts which attracted my attention. One of them was this device which was wonderful. What is it? It is an ice and soda machine set up in the Tisco works in 1914. Why was this set up? This was set up with an objective to give relief to workers laboring in extreme temperatures. It was the first of its kind in a steel plant anywhere in the world, and it was the first steel plant in India. Each worker was served a cold bottle of soda every hour. Well, if the students who are here will know what to ask the director. And every 2 hours in the winter months. Every hour in summer, every 2 hours in the winter months. The machine was manufactured by Barnett and Foster engineers in London. This, I think, was a visionary approach to workers' welfare to get them to work under very difficult climatic and local plant conditions. Whose idea was this? This is the kind of question that a historian interested in the trivia of history would ask. My guess is that it was Mr. Punch, because he was the one who was interested in this kind of detail. I'll show you some old photographs to show how the institute has actually changed over the years. This is a picture of the girls at the institute in the 1940s. And all their names are there because this is Rajeshwari Chatterjee, who was the first dean of the engineering faculty in the institute, who was still around when our centenary year was being done, who gave us a huge amount of encouragement, although she was very old by that time. And it now turns out, and this I came to know only recently, I think this girl here, Violet D'Souza now, I think at the age of 101 or 102, has been located in Delhi. And what I hope to do is to be able to go and see and meet her once. This is the Aeronautical Engineering Department on August 15th, 1947. And you can see the celebration. That's the group photograph. It has an interesting mixture of Englishmen, Indians dressed in various styles, and also right in the back there, which I've magnified for you, Free India Celebrations, and Jai Hind is the slogan written over there. So this will also tell you a little bit about the sign of the times. You would not have been more patriotic than everybody would have been extraordinarily patriotic on August 15th, 1947. I wasn't born then. And even though I'm old, I wasn't born then. The slogan that I have chosen there is Jai Hind. And today there is a great discussion on the kind of slogan which should be aired in gatherings where patriotism is concerned. The institute grew over the years. By 1933, the physics department came because Raman came to Bangalore. But the next department which was set up was really biochemistry. And this was because even then it was recognized that biochemistry, nutrition was extraordinarily important. The history of biochemistry is really the history of research in nutrition in many ways. Look at this evolution of departments between the period 1942 to 1956. This is driven by the need of independent India. You need industry, therefore the engineering departments have to come. This is why the Indian Institute of Science is the single most important institute for understanding the history of higher education in India, simply because the engineering department started here, although it is called an Indian Institute of Science. The IITs came very much later. J.C. Ghosh, the first director of IIT Kharagpur. The first IIT director was director of the Indian Institute of Science. He was a chemist who went and became the director of IIT Kharagpur. The project officer who set up IIT Bombay was P.K. Kelkar, who was a faculty member in the electrical communication engineering department of the institute. He was a lecturer there before he went to BJTI. And he is the man who, after setting up IIT Bombay, was the first director of IIT Kanpur. It is because of these kinds of documents which are there that Kim Sebely said that it is IISc which provided the intellectual capital for setting up these. He then goes back and says, I'll have to dig back as to when he visited the institute, probably in 1966, when I met Dr. Satish Dhawan. Satish Dhawan is one of my most distinguished predecessors. What was the question which Satish Dhawan asked Kim Sebely? He says, I recall him asking me why the mission or goal of the institute included both arts and sciences. Because that's the original document. The director of the institute in the 1960s is now asking a visiting American graduate student who's looking into this, why did the original proposal have a certain vision? Why is it the way it is today? And he says, I was able to sketch some of the reasons why this was the case and why medical, educational and social research had been cut out. You will see in the debate which has happened in years later, we don't have any medical research within our institutions. But it was there in the original document that there must be medical research right at the beginning when the institution was conceived. Many institutions have been midwifed into existence. The institute, I always say, is probably one of the most efficient midwives around for scientific institutions. There are some you would know. Homi Bhabha conceived the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research when he was on the campus of the Indian Institute of Science as a reader in physics. He might have wanted to escape from the clutches of C. Raman. That we do not know. But whatever the reason, he conceived of it when he was here. The first atomic energy training school was held at the Indian Institute of Science. HAL in Bangalore came out of the first aircraft designer in India, Khadge, was on the faculty of the Indian Institute of Science before he went over to HAL. ISRO, of course, Satish Dhawan took over right in the early days of ISRO when Vikram Sarabhai suddenly passed away. A CFTRI in Mysore came when V. Subramaniam went from here in the 1920s to set up CFTRI in that palace over there. NCBS, I recall the days when it used to be, it was called the old KIFR Center, but actually it should have been called the old Institute Center. The Jawaharlal Nehru Center in Bangalore came up out of the campus. But this is what the staff and students of the institute looked like in April 1912. The first batch of students joined in 1911. This is the first batch of students. This is what they looked 100 years later when the first batch of undergraduate students joined. And you can see that then is the transformation of India. What then do we see? Is it an educational institution or is it a research institution? It is actually a university, which is both an educational institution and also a research institution. And you can do no better than to quote the one man who thought of research even before Jamsetji Tata, that is Mahendralal Sarkar, who started the Indian Association for Cultivation of Science in Calcutta in 1876. He says the world's chief and greatest discoveries have been made by those who had or have to teach. Educational institutions still furnish the best laboratories for research. Pure research institutions have only recently come into existence. There has been no better statement for the role of a research university. Johns Hopkins was the model for Tata for the Indian Institute of Science. Padshaw and Tata visited the Johns Hopkins University. Remember that Johns Hopkins was the first university, research university in America, but there was no undergraduate education when it started, and it had only postgraduate courses and research. But things changed, you know, and Edmund Burke, whom I quote twice here, says we must all obey the great laws of change. which is why the institute's also transformed over the years to introduce undergraduate education, and it is the most powerful law of nature and the means perhaps of its conservation. I think Burke was anticipating Darwin, whom we discuss so hotly. Those ideas came a little later, but I think biology and human nature are both represented in this court. Why have an archive at all? Why worry about history? Quote Burke again, on Reflections in Revolution, France, says people will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. We must look backward to our ancestors, however far you go, but you must do it based on facts, on collected documents, historical records, verbal records, whatever you have. But to compare India and America at that time, Carnegie and Tata were more or less contemporaries. Carnegie conceived of the idea of the Carnegie Institute of Technology, where later I studied the Carnegie Technical Stores in 1900. Tata had already conceived the Indian Institute of Science in 1896. It took a long time. He conceived it in 1900, it was started in 1900. And so they were thinking, different ideas were coming in different parts of the world. For the last thing, this is what Curzon said. Finally, when he was beginning in 1901 to reconcile to the idea of providing an annual maintenance grant to the Institute, what was for many years called the non-plan grant of the Institute, but today we may call it something else. It's probably some kind of maintenance grant. Tata requested £5,000 a year. Curzon said, nothing doing. He says, Tata entirely owes it to me that he gets anything. And if he is not wise enough to accept it, I'm ready to drop the whole thing tomorrow. And fortunately he didn't, and I don't know exactly what the sum of money which came from the British government at that time eventually was, but the Institute was actually set up, still survives. And one of the things that whether you're young or old, whether you are thinking about education, research, history, country, whatever, you must look and ask the question, if you have an institution which has survived 110 years, there must be in that institution some genes which allow it to be resilient under the very many varying and turbulent circumstances which the country has faced over time. And there is something that can be learned from that kind of resilience. I was at the Institute really all the way from the time I joined as a faculty member to the time that I retired. And so in some way I don't think the full story of the institution itself has still been clearly understood and recorded. But I think as one tries to get more documents, more papers, more people come forward with things that they have, you will actually get a better and more complete history. But I'm going to conclude by showing you one physical demonstration. And it's sort of a coincidence that I found this, because I don't throw anything in my little apartment. I keep everything. So there's a mound of papers, and today I was cleaning them. And then I found something that I had retained from everything else that I had sent to the Institute archives as a copy. And, or maybe it was sent to me again as a copy. So I thought I would just bring this. This is a copy from the, India Office Library Records. And this is a copy of a letter written to Lord Raleigh by Curzon. And now you can see Curzon's language, Curzon's, and this is one in which he says that he is really not in favor of the scheme at all. And this is dated November 6th, 1901, which is more or less around the same time that I took that quote from Deepak Kumar's historical article. For those of you who are interested in other kinds of history, archival records provide a fascinating glimpse into the ideas that people have had. In the maybe around the 1920s, Tata was very keen on starting bacteriology and tropical medicine, which were actually originally thought of in the scheme. And the person he recruited to the task to write a report was Haskell. And the Haskell-Tata correspondence is actually available in an archive in Israel. And Deepak Kumar of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, once visiting this archive in Israel, saw this document, copied it, and sent it to me. So I think when you set up archives, you can see that there will be lots of interesting things which you may document. They will be of no interest immediately, but they will be of great interest maybe 75 or years later. So when NCBS celebrates its centenary, there is only one thing that I can say with certainty, and that is very, very few people in this audience will still be there. And if they are there, they will be like Violet D'Souza, who might just be able to make it. And therefore, even those of you who are very young must now take trouble to see that archival records are actually preserved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Balaram. We'll take questions from the audience.
I'm curious about one name that you didn't mention, Mokshagundam Vishveshwaraya. Where does he fall in this narrative?
He actually doesn't come into the early days of the Institute. Vishveshwaraya came later into the court of the Institute, and he was president of the court of the Institute. This is much later. This is more towards the late 20s and mid 30s. The period at which I stopped is 1909. He had no role in the, in fact, it turns out, and this is something interesting that's come from the Tata archives at Jamsetji, Vishveshwaraya's early trips to Europe to see many works of engineering, to be introduced to engineers abroad, were all funded by the Tatas. And so a lot of the letters which I wasn't interested in, but Mr. Ahuja anyway copied and brought along, were letters, those who are interested in Vishveshwaraya might find those letters fascinating. So, yeah. Yeah.
So, hello, sir. So there are a lot of institutes in Bangalore which have celebrated centenary, like they have been around 100 years since
yes.
So is there any record of any sort of collaboration between those institutes and
do you have a specific example?
Probably the Central College.
Yes, like a Central College. Now the Central College, very interesting thing. The Central College was a college. See, Bangalore University came very much later. Even Mysore University came very much later. You see, there was at that time the Madras Presidency. And under the umbrella of the Madras Presidency, there was Madras University. So if you look at the history of higher education in India, 1857 there were 3 universities created, all following Macaulay. Madras, Bombay and Kolkata. So these are in the period 1857 to about 1920. Many things came later. Banaras Hindu University by Madan Mohan Malaviya and so on. Delhi University, all of them came later. So Central College was a college under Madras University. In fact, in the proposal to create the Indian Institute of Science, you will find that the English principal of Central College would have also written a reviewer's report on the proposal, as if you may call it that. The reviewer's reports on this proposal are remarkably detailed and hugely informative. So there is this connection. Central College and the Institute were associated quite closely, like I told you, in the journal Current Science, which was started in the 1930s and so on. Yes.
We'll take 3 quick questions.
Yes.
So, how does archival work in this century right now? Because letters are mostly bygone. So, how would you go about archiving email and whatever is the news engine? I know it's probably not the problem of you, but Venkat. But how do you think one should go about archiving right now?
I don't know. Now it's actually very difficult actually to think of separating what I call signal from noise. If you you can actually store any amount of information, and what will happen if you store any amount of information is, however good your search algorithms, you'll never find anything. You need still to have some kind of filtering on what is most important and so on. I really don't know. But I think the new technologies allow you to do many things which the old things did not. They take away some of the romance of the whole thing in some way, I would say.
How about the Ratan Tata has taken the responsibility for the progressing the institute?
Well, the connection between the Tatas and the Institute is a historical one. It hasn't been a great substantial one except in terms of grants occasionally once in a while for a specific project. There's an annual rental income which comes even today from the Bombay properties of the Institute, in which for a long time TIFR were there along with many other illegal tenants. And but that's about it. And they are represented on the council of the Institute. They're important. They're very important in the sense that you maintain a historical connection. The Tata Trust support good projects if they are there. But they do that anywhere. It's not because it was never an institute of the Tatas. It was from the beginning an institute of the government of India. This is why when independence happened, there was a one-to-one mapping of the governance structure of the institute. That is why the Indian Institute of Science is still the only institute in India to have 3 members of parliament on the council of the institute. We have 2 representatives nominated by the Speaker of the Lok Sabha and 1 representative of the Rajya Sabha nominated by the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha. And the Indian universities, East, North, South, West, have representatives because they're all supposed to be there.
I have a
Thank
curious question. Was it always called the Indian Institute of Science?
It was always called the Indian Institute of Science. It was called the Jamsetji Tata didn't want his name on the institution. He was very clear because one of Curzon's objections to the Tata proposal was that Tata was doing this to actually secure the private endowment for his family and to also get become a baronet and get from the King of England some kind of honor. And that's how Curzon interpreted the offer. So it was always the Indian Institute.
Why I asked you this question, as a child I visited, and it was called Tata Institute.
Yes, it's called the Tata Institute. Even today you will find in the Karnataka State Archives, some of the files of the Institute on the outside will be called Tata Institute. But actually, in my view, there can be no greater tribute to Jamsetji Tata than this. That without the name being formally associated with the Institute, the local population over 100 years later still associates the Institute with his name. So his name has become immortal because of this. So that is remarkable, I would say, yes.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Balaram. I have a question about Sister Nivedita. Among the many, and Patrick Geddes as well, among the many links that pop up when you search for Swami Vivekananda and Jane Tata, 1 or 2 of them argue that there was a sustained role played by Sister Nivedita in campaigning for the Institute, in setting up of the Institute. And I've heard Ramachandra Guha talk about the role, perhaps even a significant role of Patrick Geddes in setting up the Institute. Is that an exaggeration? And
It's a complete exaggeration.
Whether any of the communications between Geddes and Nivedita actually went to Tata or the British
It's
government.
complete
the Indian government.
exaggeration. Tata's advisors at that time when the institute was set up was one single man. And I don't think there's any correspondence other than the casual correspondence where the proposal is discussed. See, Sister Nivedita, because she was an Irish woman and she had a London residence, was in London at many times during those first few years of that 1903, 2, 3, 4, 5 period, and a little bit later also. So she hosted a lot of Indians. In fact, she hosted J.C. Bose. She's hosted Padsha. She provided him with access to Royal Society, Ramsay, Raleigh, that kind of people who were involved. But nothing beyond that. Patrick Geddes did many things in India. But you know, there is an old, when you look at history, you should remember there's an old French historian who actually wrote this, always stayed in my mind. He said that there's one thing about history. History blots out, he said, and I am not my words, his words. He says history blots out small merit and fattens big glory. So what happens is that you sometimes begin to attribute everything to people who have. See, neither Mr. Padsha is unknown. Sister Nivedita is known. She is known to people in diverse areas. There's a context. It's like Raman. Everything here is attributed to Raman. The editorial for starting the Indian Academy of Sciences, the starting of the journal Current Science. So one should be very careful. One should look at documents before you really, if you say something, you must have a document to support something that you say. Otherwise, it's hearsay. See, there are any number of accounts on the internet on the conversation between Jamsetji Tata and Swami Vivekananda. It's almost like that they had a listening device there.
Okay, this is a lovely note to wrap things up. Let's thank Professor Balaram again for the talk.